Hello, and welcome to this episode of Keeping Her Keys. I'm really excited about this episode for many reasons, but I guess the two main ones is that the subject is one that is really central to my own journey. Um, and it's really related to the personal keys I keep. And the other big reason is that I am joined today by one of my favorite human beings, um, who inspires me and I learned from like almost daily. So, our topic is going to be gender, the goddess, and queerness. So, I'm inviting you into the intersection of those three. Hekate, of course, is very much associated with a triple crossroads. And so we are building that energy in that container of exploring gender, the goddess, and queerness in that three-way crossroads, and that we are abiding in the space where they intersect, that liminal space where all three can flow together in really beautiful and healing ways. So before we get underway, I just want to introduce my co-host for today, the fabulous Mae, who is a senior student and a guide in Covina, which is the online school that I run. Uh, Mae is both a person who has lived in that crossroads personally, and is a subject matter expert on the three roads that lead to our intersection, to our space that we're creating, and also works in a professional way, advocating and representing gender and queerness at work. So it's like we're at this triple crossroads, and you have like the triple kind of different arenas where you've explored all of this. So welcome to Keeping Your Keys podcast. I'm so excited that you're here.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here. I'm so honored that you asked me. I feel all kinds of warm and fuzzy right now.
Me too. So, we have to do something before we begin. So, we have the same mug. So, if you're listening, you won't be able to see this. But if you're watching, we're just going to do this before we start. You ready?
Yes, I am.
Mugs up.
Oh no, can you
Mugs
see
up.
mine? There we go.
Cheers. Hail Hecate with our same mugs.
Hail Hekate. There we go. So weird with the background, it doesn't always show.
Right. So, I always start. I mean, if you're familiar with me, you know what? We always start by lighting a candle. So, today we will start by lighting our candle. And let's create the energy, which we usually do, the cleansing energy with the left hand in a counterclockwise motion. And so let's just create our space today by cleansing ourselves of any hurtful experiences we may have had around gender and queerness or the goddess. Let's just kind of let it all go. We are releasing a lot of that really burdensome, the damage that's been done to us. And let's encircle ourselves in a glorious, so this is right hand clockwise, in a glorious protective space of nourishment, of mutual support, and of celebrating gender, the goddess, and queerness. So, hail Hecate, who, of course, many of us connect to really strongly. Many of us who identify somewhere in that intersection, right? of gender and queerness. A lot of us are really drawn to Hecate or called by Hecate. And one of my first articles that I wrote when I started keeping her keys was called Hecate, Guardian of the Marginalized. And I base this on a lot of the research that I've done on Hecate's history and who our beloved Hecate was associated with, both in like mythology and in like first person historical records that exist today, and in how she was kind of understood in a more like spiritual or religious context to the ancients. So for me, what emerged because of her association with Crossroads, with the road itself as Enodia, her association with like the outcasts of society, you know, to me, in my thinking, that's very much like an association with what I would call, in an academic sense, the marginalized today. Although, of course, that's not the best term. But it is a term that does kind of describe, I think, those of us who live outside of the bounds of mainstream society. So I do hail and welcome to our circle Hecate, guardian of the marginalized. And she has many ancient epithets that speak to this. And one that's really near and dear to me is Corotrophus, which is specific for protection of children and the vulnerable. So hail and welcome to our circle. I think, having been a Hecatean lo these many years, as we were talking before we turned on the recording, um, that as I kind of observe over all this time, is that there does seem to be like a common thread among many who are drawn to Hecate, that we do, by our very nature, tend to abide at intersections, and that we don't really fit in any of the places that those roads might lead as individual places, but where we do find our space is where they all kind of merge together in really interesting ways.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that.
So let's spend a few minutes just on our beloved Hecate and kind of talking about her as a healing force. Um, and I know you mentioned before we turned on the recording that you don't really remember when you were called by Hecate. Maybe you were just birthed a Hecatean.
Possibly. In the mythos that is Mae's life.
Right? um, but what do you think, like looking back kind of over the years in your experience, because I know you've been part of like the broader kind of pagan community or spiritual community, whatever you want to call it, like for a long time now, like me.
Mhm.
Like looking back over the years and your relationship with Hecate, how do you feel like personally that she's like guided you
Mhm.
towards your own, like how is she kind of abided in this crossroads with you? 'Cause-
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I really was having a hard time thinking about the answer to that earlier, but now I'm remembering an incident, well, not an incident, but a time when I was in high school. And I remember starting to really, that was around the time that I encountered Wicca and the neo-paganism movement in general. And, I'm going to date myself here, but, picked up my first Starhawk book or my Cunningham books and my Buckland books. Yeah, right. And I don't remember exactly. I mean, I've been a fan of Greek mythology since I was a wee baby, like in kindergarten. I grew up watching Clash of the Titans, that sort of thing. And so I'm sure I knew Hekate before then, but I remember being really drawn to the epithet for her, the Roman epithet of trivia, right?
Mm.
Like, and then, and as I'm thinking back on that, I think I was really drawn to, like you said, I didn't know the word liminal at that time, but that liminality, that place where anything is possible. And through her, anything was possible. And I wasn't raised Christian, so I didn't have, kind of that programming of, how I know like there's that saying that through Christ all things are possible. So this was a whole new thing for me to relate to, right? This space of all things and no things existing at once. And I want to say that is what really drew me to Hecate, is that kind of that feeling of possibility because when you're a teenager and you're kind of trying to figure out your place in the world and you're getting out from under the yoke of your parents and what they want for you and you're kind of trying to like figure out what it is you want and what to do with your life after high school and do I want to marry this dude I've been hanging out with for the last 3 years? Because in my time and place, like it was very common for people to get married right after high school. And even though I was going to college, like that was in the back of my mind and all of these other things. And I think that it was definitely that kind of realm of all possibilities that drew me to her, if that makes sense.
I love that. So thank you for adding that energy as we're creating our space, our liminal space here at this triple crossroads. And now I want to ask you about like what identities do you bring to this space? So what identities are most important to you?
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that question. So, I identify as a pansexual, non-binary woman, which throws people. I think people think non-binary means square in the center of that spectrum sometimes, and I definitely still identify as a woman, just maybe closer to center than some other women. Um, so yeah, I think those are my big identities in the queer space. I use they them pronouns, but I'm very open about pronoun. I've been called everything under the sun, so it's fine. I'm very flexible. Um, it's something that I think I spend a lot of time thinking about.
Mhm.
Non-binariness as an idea is something that's fairly new to me. I'm in my 40s and I just discovered it maybe 5 years ago. And when I read that term and kind of figured out what it meant, I was like, this is so affirming for me.
Mm.
It was a blessing to hear that, and to be named and to have a name to put to my experience. So yeah, I bring the non-binary woman label to this conversation mainly.
That's really beautiful. Thank you. So I think most everybody knows that I identify as a woman. I haven't really explored my binariness, my binarity. Um, but I love thinking about gender. And, it makes a lot of sense to me when you say, when you heard the term non binary, that it was very affirming for you. Because even though that term maybe doesn't have that same kind of resonance for me, there are certain words that when I did hear them, I felt resonance. Um, so I'm a cisgendered woman, and you and I were talking a lot about sexual identity because we said we wanted to put queerness into this conversation as well. So I
Oh,
would say I
absolutely.
certainly identify, I am okay with the queer label, although I don't really need a label for my sexual behavior. But I'm okay with that one. Like I'm okay with it.
Yeah, I like that one. If I say pansexual because I feel like it's a more precise label than queerness, but queer is really how I self-identify a lot. It's a good label for me, which is funny because when I was growing up, it was kind of a hurtful label, when I was coming of age. And I like that our community has kind of reclaimed that.
Yeah, I do too. And you're
Yeah.
right. It used to be, it was not, it was a derogatory term. And now it has a different connotation. And And that's part of, like, I sometimes call this whole thing about gender and the goddess and queerness, I call it like the beautiful revolution, because in our lifetime, so much has changed since we were in high school. And I really appreciate what you said about where the world was at when you and I were in high school and how much the world has changed. Because I think in the current political climate, it's easy for us to lose sight of the gains that have been made. And it's really important for us to honor them and to be committed to ensuring that not only they are protected, but that they are enhanced and strengthened. Because certainly, like transphobia, um, hate crimes against people somewhere on the queer spectrum, and I'll use that term, but that for me, maybe we should just do that, like do a definition thing of what we mean by queerness. Because I think gender, we'll get into that in a minute, the goddess, I think y'all know goddess, sacred feminine, but maybe with queerness, we should talk about what we mean by that, because we have in Covina, there is multiple articles in the Covina culture space where I talk about gender and queerness, and people will ask questions. And for me, someone who's like, I first taught the psychology of gender over 20 years ago. So sometimes I forget that there are people who are new to all of this.
Mhm.
So I'll let you define what you mean by queerness, and then we'll take it from there.
Yeah, for me, queerness is anything that's kind of outside of the generally accepted cis heteronormative, so if cis, for those who don't know, cis is kind of a shorthand term for those who identify with the gender that they were assigned at birth. Heteronormative is kind of how our society sees the one woman, one man model as the norm for romantic and sexual coupling. So for me, queer is anything that kind of falls outside of that. And that's a huge definition. I mean, there's a lot of room in that definition. It's a big umbrella. And I kind of see it as an umbrella. A lot of people can identify with queer. A cis hetero woman can identify as queer if you're not just narrowly on that path of cis heteronormative, right? Like, there are times when you may, I mean, I don't know. I'm very gender fluid, on the non-binary spectrum. So like some days I feel more masculine, some days I feel more feminine. It's like the Facebook status, right? The Facebook relationship status. It's complicated. Like, I've actually used that when people are like, what, like how would you define your gender? And I'm like, it's complicated for me, you know? So
How
I
would you
think
define your gender? Yes.
yes, exactly. There is one. There is one. Some people would be agender and don't have one in their mind.
Right?
So that's totally valid too. But yeah, for me, I have one and it changes, day by day,
I
hour
love
by
that
hour.
though. I think that's so beautiful that you're allowing yourself to be who you truly are. So let's just recap. So by queerness, we mean anyone who finds their space in gender and or sexuality. And by sexuality, we mean things related to sexual behavior, not just between two people. And it can also be the not having sexual behavior. So those two big things, if a person is somewhere outside of, it's a male, female, or man, woman, dyad, committed, monogamous, sexual relationship as the goal. Maybe not, you're not doing it at the time, but the goal, this is like supposed to be the goal. So that heteronormative thing where you find someone who is the opposite gender of you and that there are only two genders, and then you form a unit that is monogamous. I think that's when I say it, it just becomes more and more like
It sounds so clinical.
right? It's like
But I think that's good, you know? I think that's a good way to describe it.
because I think it's important. One of the my like how you were talking about non-binary being very affirmative for you, for me, something that's really been pinging for me for the last several years is that there is room for within queerness to be asexual or aromantic, and that it's not seen as defective. That it is a sexuality that's legitimate as any other. So to be able to find that space,
Mhm.
because that's very not heteronormative.
I agree. And I think that's a very important space. Yeah, I like that too.
So we have lots of space in our big queer crossroads here, and lots of space for gender fluidity, and all in this energy of Hekate as this great goddess who, since her earliest recorded records, was associated with those who were outside of the mainstream. And I think that's why we find a special affiliation. Like you said, like Hecate is the one who is no things and all things, but she is never the one who is kind of like the front and center civilized goddess. She's not like the queen on the throne of society. She's the one who is the mediator, the one in the crossroads between all of these things. So for me, that really, I think that's why part of why I so identify with her, because for me, like growing up where I did, I like you, like I didn't really know that anything outside of heteronormativity was really a possible something that existed anywhere outside of books. Like I did have like one YA book that with the two teenage girls made out with each other. And it was like hidden under my
Scandalous.
bed.
Yeah.
Didn't want mom to find that of all things. And the sacred feminine was out of bounds because I was raised Pentecostal as well. So unlike people maybe who were raised Catholic, who were at least exposed to Mary and the saints and so on, in my upbringing, women were completely subservient. And so I had it like when I was in my senior year in high school, I had all these experiences where my eyes were kind of like open, where I discovered Artemis, a queer girl's best friend, um, and discovered that actual human beings outside of books could be gay, because I had a friend who had uncles, and we would go to their apartment when they weren't there and watch gay porn. So I discovered Artemis and gay porn in my in my senior year in high school. It was a lot for my little. I never fit in the Pentecostal world. I never bought into any of it. So for me, it was like it launched me on a trajectory of uh, discovering who I really was.
Mhm.
Because unlike you, I had a lot of programming to wade through. But I think we all have programming from society, even if,
We
our
do.
family of origin isn't particularly like the one I grew up in. There's a lot to kind of
There
wade through.
is. Yeah, I agree. I mean, there's just so much. I mean, because even if you aren't raised in any kind of traditional Abrahamic religious structure, there's still a lot of pressure from society to, to marry somebody of the opposite gender. And there's only two genders, and all of that exists. And there's just so much more programming around religious beliefs and spiritual beliefs on top of all of that. So yeah, I definitely did not escape the programming, not at all.
And I think one of the big conditioning or programming areas that you run into when you are someone who connects to the sacred feminine, whether it's Hecate or some of the other ones that you and I both love, Artemis, Caradwin. Who else are some of your favorites?
Kali, Kaliak. I love Hathor. Hathor really has always spoken to me. Sekhmet. Yeah, there's just so many beautiful aspects of the feminine, the sacred feminine.
So there's so many of them. And, like when you are drawn to this, one of the things that I have repeatedly bumped into, and I think you have too, is this business where only like cis women can be involved with the sacred feminine. And part of what inspired me, there's a couple of things that inspired me to ask you to come on the podcast and talk about all this. So one is that something happened in social media land where I said something, and there were some there was like this turfy backlash. So if you're not familiar with the term turf, because I know it's a really specific one, so it basically is trans exclusive radical feminist, which means, in practical terms, it means someone who denies that trans women are women, basically, in a nutshell. It's there's a lot to it, but in a nutshell. So I said something. There were comments that were turfy. Um, I said things to these people. It's evolved. I think you might have been involved in this as well.
Hmm.
And then I like banned them from the social media space. And after that, I don't think I've said this to you before. After that, I had like several email messages thanking me for my really clear stance that I won't tolerate transphobic behavior on my social media. Like
Right, right,
I don't need that follower. Thank you.
right,
You will get banned for anything that's transphobic. So that happened. And then there's this other thing that you don't know about either. So on the YouTube and in my email, this is so consistently I get emails and messages from people thanking me for just like you and I were talking about this earlier. It's like I don't feel like I should be thanked for this, but thanking me for speaking out about queerness. I don't identify as trans, but I'm certainly 100% supportive of people being who they are. I'm not against people just being who they are. Like that seems so weird to me. Like why would anybody be against that? Um, but the other thing that often happens, and it's fairly common, I probably get a few messages a month, is from cisgendered men who write to me asking if, as a man, they can become, I'm going to say involved, but I don't mean that in a weird way, but that they can connect with Hekate.
yeah, I think that is I think that's very prevalent, honestly, because I know in my own personal circles that I have spent time in, both on and offline, so many people who identify as witches, let alone Hecateans, are women. Um, and I think that as a cis male, I could imagine that it would be hard to go into a space where you may feel unwelcome. I mean, and it is a space, I don't know. I mean, I don't want to sound like I'm saying like, oh, this is an experience that you're not used to, right? Like as a cis male, you're used to being able to move in whatever space you want to move in, and I don't mean that in any kind of critical or judgmental way. It's just the way it is. And it's very outside the stereotype as well. I think, Hecate and witches are very much seen as a women only club, right? And I think I see, when I see men in our groups and I see men standing up online and saying, "Hey, I am also a witch," whatever flavor of witch they are, I'm actually I have a lot of admiration for that. Um, because I do think, and then there's also, the whole I don't know really how to put this, but there's the ultra feminine spheres too, right? Like these the divine feminine women only groups, and I've been members of these groups. I have nothing against these groups. These groups are wonderful, safe places for women, especially when they include trans women, in my opinion, but that's my opinion. Um, but it's like we need those spaces too, right? We need those spaces to celebrate the divine feminine, but I think it does cement that connection where this is only accessible to you if you were born with a uterus, right? And that's not true. We all need that divine feminine. We all need that connection, no matter how we were born and moved through the world.
Oh, that's such a good point. So when I get these emails, I say, well, if you feel drawn to Hecate, you should, my advice would be to run towards your truth. Follow her torch, right? Claim the key. If that
Yeah,
feels right and true and beautiful and nourishing to you, go towards it,
right. It should be that simple.
right? Follow that torch. The key has been offered because I think there's so much wrapped around all of this. Like you said, there is this fact that it's mostly women, both cis and trans, who are drawn to Hecate, and that among our ranks, like we can talk about Covina, right? Covina is like 95% uh, women, be it cis, trans, or people who identify as non binary. And when it comes to cisgendered heterosexual men, we have one. Like sometimes we have two. Um,
They
so
pop in and out
they
sometimes.
pop in and out. So it's easy. So I understand why they would be intimidated. And I really like how you said, like, our container that we've created at this crossroads juncture that's very liminal is a very safe space for us. And it wouldn't feel safe to someone perhaps who is like a cisgendered, heteronormative white male assigned at birth sort of thing, um, because it's a very different place for them where the rules of society that they're used to that give them an advantage, like, they don't apply. Things are
Right,
very different
right.
in, at least in the spaces I create and lead. Things work very differently than they do in mainstream society. And creating that to make it safe, like I said, we have one or maybe two, um out of a, like, and we're a decent sized organization. So when I founded Covina, there was the question, like, do I say this is for women only? And of course, by women, I mean I include trans women and the non-binary, like anyone. Do I include anyone who isn't a cis male? Or do I also make it open for people who are cis, who identify as cis males? And I decided to be inclusive. And we've experimented with different ways of doing this over the past 3 years since Covina started, like as a online organization with a structure, that kind of functions as a real school. And how do we hold space for the fact that we allow all genders into Covina, and at the same time, when there is so many of us who were traumatized by cisgendered heteronormative males in the past, and to hold space for them and be respectful that they are not they are not the men who hurt us. And I really think people need to, like, those men who follow Hecate's torch are very brave,
I agree.
because it's taking them into a different terrain. It's taking them into the sacred feminine.
Hmm.
And it's kind of like we live in opposite world here in our little liminal zone, where queerness is normal, gender fluidity is normal, um, the sacred feminine is applauded. Doesn't mean we denounce the sacred masculine. We are exploring all of these things.
Right.
It's curiosity and openness to unburden ourselves from the damage that was done to us in the past. Like, it's a very different world that we occupy compared to kind of like where a lot of spaces in the broader world still are today.
Right. I would agree with that.
Um, it's a lovely world we've built here at the Crossroads.
It is.
Um, that being said, sometimes we have to step outside of our sacred container and function in the broader world. And I know you are doing work in a professional capacity with your career in terms of gender and queerness. I
Hmm.
don't think the goddess gets invited to the table, does she?
I always bring her along, but not everybody knows.
Okay.
She's always there. She and there's a couple of they thems and some he hims that come along with me, my little entourage. I hate to sound like I'm diminishing them, but they're I have my allies, I'll say
Yeah, our
that.
allies. And when you say they, them, I'm just like, all of a sudden I hear Hermes saying, like,
Yes.
don't forget about me. I am the they, them.
Right. Hermes, I consider Dionysus a they them, although I think he's a they he, like
Yeah.
um yeah, definitely. And the bearded Venus, I think people
Yep.
forget about the
Oh, the
bearded
bearded
Venus.
Venus. Tell us
Yeah.
more about the bearded Venus.
So I don't really know like a lot about where this I mean, I've done a little bit of research, but I'm just really kind of introduced to the concept. And, there's a lot of these statues. I think there was some from Cyprus, but a lot of them were from Rome, the Roman Empire, the Roman areas. And they're these figures of either a Aphrodite or a Venus with a beard, or some of them look like they're men but they're garbed as women, right? And some of them look like they have women's bodies but have beards. And so there's some theories out there. I'm not sure how much scholarly um, research has been done, but there's some theories out there that in some of these temples where these figures were found, that they were kind of a haven for trans women. Because at the time they didn't have things like hormone treatments and electrolysis, right? But they were able to be themselves in these spaces. So I've been kind of following those threads, but I'd like to do a lot more research. But yeah, it's a really interesting thing that these things exist, and they've been called like Aphroditus, and instead of Aphrodite. And there's like also the fact that Venus has a masculine ending, right? In Latin, so there's a lot of little threads to follow there. It's kind of interesting.
So you've been doing a lot of research for Venus within your role as a guide in Covina.
Hmm.
So Venus Scotia, like the dark Venus, which I think we'll tackle in a different episode. But we've been really talking a lot about the complexities of Venus and doing some reclaiming around them as well.
Hmm.
Because we see, I am your Venus.
Right.
We're shaving our legs with our Venus razor. It kind of makes us see Venus as this purely like hypersexualized,
Ultra feminine.
ultra feminine spirit, when in
Right.
fact Venus is much more complex
Absolutely.
um, than your pink razor. You know what I mean, right? Those Venus razors.
Yes, the Venus racers. Yeah.
I was like, is that too obscure a reference?
I think in the US and Canada it's going to be a safe one at least.
Okay. um, and then, like talking about the epithets and all of this, it reminds me of this interaction I had. It's only happened to me once, but so some of the epithets of Hekate from the ancient sources, like the Greek magical papyri, in particular, and even kind of in this text known as the Chaldean oracles, there's a lot of like what we might say is like gender fluidity around Hecate in different ways. But in the Greek magical papyri, and I think a couple of other ancient sources, Hecate is called the hierosphere, which means sacred fire. So I knew this as a masculine title. Like you said, Venus, it's masculine because of the ending. So if you know a little bit of Latin or Greek, you can kind of figure out if a title or a name is masculine or feminine. But so I knew this. So I shared this on social media. I was talking about hierosphere as I often do. And someone, it's like that person who walks into the room.
So there's always that person, right?
There's always that person, right? They walk into the room, they're like, what do you know, little lady? Hierosphere is a masculine title. It can't possibly be associated with Hecate. And I was like, but I'm not talking to you because it's pointless. But it's like that thing. It's like, well, Hecate's a goddess. She can't have masculine titles. And it's like, I didn't invent this. This is what translators, for the most part, a lot of this translation was done in the Victorian era and in the early part of the 20th century of these classical texts. A lot of the translations that we still use today were done by these white guys, well-educated, wealthy white guys. And if them, when they were translating, kept that title as masculine, then by Hecate, I believe that's probably what it actually is.
Right. I have receipts.
And that to the ancients, at least in these sources, they were connecting to Hecate like in a more fluid way. So hierosphere is one, sacred fire, it's a masculine title. Kitamos is another one, which means glorious or the bright one. That's a masculine title. And Kitamos is one of the, like a really common epithet for Hecate's frequent companion, Hermes, who is very fluid in gender and so on, in many ways. So, there are so-called masculine titles that were given to Hecate by the ancients. And like you kind of add this to the evidence about like the bearded Venus, and we see like that 2,000 years ago, they were grappling with all of this in a really sophisticated way, similar to how we're trying to navigate this crossroads in our time,
Yeah.
So I always think of that. I think, well, Hecate has a bunch of masculine epithets that people 2,000 years ago used to describe her, and they would have known what they were doing.
Right. I mean, yeah, because she was a lived real being for them. She wasn't somebody they just read about, and then tried to connect to. I mean, she was very imminent
Yes.
in the world back then in a way that, I still feel her now, but she's not as forward in our society in the modern times as she would have been for them.
Right, because I think that gets to I think a lot, and I mean I talk about this a lot. I think a lot of it gets to the fact like this rigidity, and I think Dionysus is an interesting character to discuss when we kind of go through like Dionysus. I would totally say Dionysus is a they he as well, but it's also like as the centuries passed and as civilization took hold and as things became more patriarchal, Dionysus and the stories that were told about them became much more like purely in the masculine reign of things, like over the, what I mean, over the centuries, until we end up with Apollo becoming Apollo, who had a complicated sexual history too. But over the centuries, like it became these figures, the masculine figures that had what we might call more fluidity and more queerness, kind of lost it. And especially as they became Romanized, like over the centuries, there was a lot of fluidity in ancient Greece, but it was like over the centuries, as these solar gods became more popular, and then of course we get into Christianity and Jesus, that like the solar world is so bright, it likes things harshly delimited, and the feminine in terms of the archetype for me is much more associated with the lunar, which what what is more fluid, what is softer. And of course, equanimity is the balance of the two. So I'm not saying one is right, one is wrong. I'm just saying, like, the world has become hypersolar in our time. And how do we, and I think that's why so many of us are called to the divine feminine or the archetypal feminine, which is different than feminine, like gender norms and rules, right? So maybe we should talk a little bit about that, because I think that's something that is a little bit complicated. Like, what's the
Yeah.
difference between the archetypal or divine feminine and masculine vis-a-vis like gender norms and stereotypes?
Yeah, and that could be a really hard one to suss out because it's not something that we can really remove ourselves from and study so easily, right? Like we're
Right.
living in it, and things that, if we were grown up, we were raised with a certain norm and we grew up with this certain norm, it's really hard to question that because we're like, well, that's the way it should be, and that's the way it naturally is, and that's the way it's always been. And then but then when, like you were saying, we can look back to the ancient times and we have these bearded women figures and we have, these masculine epithets for these goddesses. And, what were things always so delineated back in the day? Is this a new thing? It's not a new thing, right? But at the same time, there's a very felt sense, at least for me, about what the divine or the archetypal feminine is versus the archetypal masculine. And I had a really interesting conversation with a good friend of mine when I first started coming out as non-binary, and she is one that's very big on always wanting to acknowledge that, like we all contain both sacred masculine and sacred feminine within us. We all have the anima and the animus within us, and I think she was trying to understand where I was coming from as a non-binary person. She was like, well, yeah, we all have those both in us. And I think that's true for the gods as well. But like with the archetypal things, I think there's such a deeper felt sense versus what's been prescribed as to, like these are appropriate behaviors and expressions of the feminine, and these are appropriate behaviors and expressions for the masculine. I don't know. I don't think I'm explaining it very well, but
No, you're doing a great job, because it reminds me of something else we've been talking about a lot, kind of like in our inner circle group, which is like how Mary is understood. Because we're recording this, it's close to the holiday season, and we've been talking a lot about that. And I think it was you that raised the point, like just how Mary, mainstream Mary in the Christian church and the Catholic church, like she's very idealized as just being like a creative but passive force in the world. So she's loving and kind and caring and the mother, but
she doesn't have a lot of agency.
she doesn't have any agency over
Yeah.
her own life. Um, and it's very disconnected from the natural cycle, which is why I think so many people are drawn to like the dark goddesses or the so-called dark goddesses, because in fact, like most of the so-called dark goddesses, whether it's like Venus or Hecate or Caradwyn or Isis or any of these goddesses that certainly have um, destructive aspects, I think it's such a foreign concept for us that the sacred feminine can be anything but beatific
Right.
and benevolent,
Right.
and just a gentle creator, like you're the one who births the world, but you don't run it, and you're just there to be, I don't know what you're there to be. I think this is why,
Loving and accepting, like
yeah,
I
loving and
just, yeah.
accepting, and yeah, and even like with people, I think who like grow like who really connect with Jesus, sometimes only see Jesus that way too. And then it's
Hmm.
like, no, like Jesus kicked some ass, and
Hmm.
he was like a super queer champion of the underdog.
Right.
So he wasn't like always just loving and gentle, and like, so this whole thing, which I would say is very solar as well, because it's very much like what is masculine is powerful and just, and what is feminine is caring and weak and passive,
Hmm.
which kind of reminds me, like, of the hermetic principles of the feminine and masculine principle, right? Like what's projective, what's receptive. I
Right.
mean, you were probably trained with those a gazillion years ago, like me,
Yeah.
which always makes me think of electrical outlets.
Right.
It's like, who's the plug? Who's the, or the chalice? Of course, in paganism, it's like
The chalice and the blade.
the chalice and the blade. Can we have a moment for the chalice and the blade? And it's like, why is it? I mean, I understand anatomically
Right.
why we use that symbolism, um, but at the same time, like it puts the feminine in a really passive, receptive zone.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sorry, but Artemis skews blade for me. I don't see her as
Right?
chalice.
Exactly. Artemis is blade. We need to put that on shirts. Or even like, like the idea of like Hekate being like since antiquity associated with twin torches.
Mhm.
Um, and also like Persephone, Artemis with the torch, Demeter even with the torch, like in the Greek world, like the torch. And I remember reading Eric Neumann, the Jungian
Yeah.
analyst work, the Great Mother, like his great tome about the goddesses. There's this little paragraph when he's talking about all these goddesses with their torches. Um, and, being a man of the 1940s and 50s and so on.
Right.
And Eric Neumann is an amazing thinker. Anyway, it's a big, so it's Neumann is how you spell
Yes.
his name. And there's this tiny paragraph where he says something that these torches represent Pluto, Hades, and therefore they are phallic, and therefore the goddess with the torch embraces both the masculine and feminine. Now, I mean, you got to think about his training and background and his
Right.
reality, right? But I was
Right.
like, I took a screenshot of it with my phone. I was like, because, you know, that's his mid 20th century lens on it.
Right.
But there is something to be said, like, what is the business with all these goddesses running around with torches? I mean, like, you can't do anything with your hands when you're carrying torches.
Right. You can't.
Right?
I tried to do this in a ritual recently, actually, and I was like,
Right?
it's
You
gonna be one
cannot.
torch because I need another hand.
And it's like, even if you're a goddess, what are you going to do with them?
Right.
You're just walking around with these torches. So it's like, oh, is that, like you think about when these images were created, probably at least 3,000 years ago.
Mhm.
If you look at like the images of Enodia from Macedonia, and so on, like when it's kind of the first images of goddesses with torches in their hands,
Mhm.
it's like, why would you do that to a goddess? Like,
It's like
because
hobbling her.
and it's like, oh, it's because she's the light in the darkness. That makes a lot of sense.
Right.
But then it's also like, is that something to do with the idea that these goddesses, because they were always very specific, powerful goddesses that had darker aspects, is it something to do with that the torch is kind of phallic? And is it somehow associated with the torch itself as a phallic symbol, um, doubling up with the fact that it's the light and the darkness? I don't know if I just like I feel like everyone will be like, what did she just say?
Yeah.
It's like, this was not my idea. This is a
Right.
very learned man who died too soon after escaping the Holocaust. It's a complicated story of Eric Neumann, but in his one great book about the goddess, he had this little paragraph that I have not stopped thinking about for many years. That where the torches, like the epithets and like the bearded Venus, were
Right.
the ancients kind of being in the crossroads of all of this feminine, sacred feminine, and adding, like you said, like, so anima generally is the feminine principle or the feminine archetype, really popularized today by the work of Carl Jung in the early to mid 20th century, where he did a lot of work around anima and animus. So anima to him was intuitive, was lunar, was uh,
Receptive.
receptive, mystical, um, caring, but also had that dangerous aspect. You know, he had all this business with an both the story of Salome and like Salome as a kind of ally of his,
Mhm,
like a spiritual ally. This is
mhm,
complicated. So, and then anima is the masculine principle, which is projective, extroverted, going out into the world, power. Oh, I would say power over. Jung wouldn't have used that word, but I would say like the feminine is power with, and the animus is power over. So like the high priest, you know, that kind of energy, the kings in Taro versus the queens in Taro. So there is a lot around the archetypal feminine and masculine that I think trickles down in some ways to gender norms and stereotypes. So gender norms are just the often unstated but nevertheless powerful operating principles for how to woman or how to man or how to boy or how to girl, right? So that's what a gender norm is. And there is some variability across cultures and different groups, even like, especially here in North America, there's a lot of variability in gender norms.
mhm.
So those are and stereotypes are like girls don't play baseball, boys don't wear pink. Like that's where it gets this very specific um short kind of things that if you violate, but it has nothing there's no evidence to support it. Like there was never any evidence. No
Yeah,
one ever did a study to
right.
see if girls actually like pink more than boys.
Right. There's no
Someone in
like
an office just
intrinsic
decided
connection. Yeah.
that.
There's no like download you get at birth. That's like you installing preference for pink, EXE.
Right? I mean, you know, and then when they're like, I guess because of when I went to school, you know, there are some, I guess what I would kind of more of a factor of my age call sex differences that are linked to like biological primary and secondary sexual characteristics and different hormones in the body, that there are some things that are actually different based on biological sex characteristics. Those aren't, so that's not a gender norm. That has nothing to do with gender, right? So, you know, there's to keep all of these things clear between like biological factors compared to things that are social constructs. And gender is very much for me a social construct.
Mhm.
Um, and then when we're talking about, like you said earlier, about a uterus, people with a uterus, whether you're a person with a uterus, your gender could be masculine or male or feminine, or you could be non-binary. But that's generally a uterus has been traditionally seen as like that is a female sex characteristic. So linking back to Hekate, so like linking all this, linking my segue from biology class. We were all back in the seventh grade watching those weird movies they made us watch. Um, Back to the idea like of the goddesses that you and I are most drawn to. Like Hekate primarily is not depicted as having her own children,
Right.
although she has a role that's really near and dear to me. It's one I super identify with in my past career as an academic and researcher, which is Corotrophus, guardian of children, although she's not typically associated with having children herself. And that her frequent companion and often her and Artemis in the history, different sources, you can't really untangle like if they're just the same goddess, they're using different names for. Um, but so I don't really identify with goddesses who have like a whole bunch of children and a husband. Like those myths and those stories, I've never really connected to. So even though Hecate is a goddess, this aspect of femininity that societally we really have been taught to elevate, which is maternity and having children. For me, I don't really attune to goddesses who have kids in their stories. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It does to me too. And I think about like even the ones that I do, like Caradwyn has children, right? And the children in her story are just kind of almost like do that machine, right? Like they're just
Yeah.
there to like force the plot along and they're not really like she's not like yes, she wants them to succeed in life, but like it's not like she's portrayed as this overly nurturing, like instead of just like helping her son, right? Like be who he is in the world. She's like, I'm going to make a potion to change you, right? Yeah, it's not exactly like the most healthy dynamic, right? And then I think too, when you think about even like in the Roman social arena, right? These goddesses were not in the norms at that time either, right? Because women in a lot of Roman history were basically there just to breed more Romans.
Right.
Like they weren't necessarily people with their own agency. And so I think it's really interesting that they did have these goddesses who stood outside of those bounds of society. Like to think about, Artemis living off in the woods with her pack of wild women, right? Like or Dionysus with his Maenads, or, I mean, all of these, I think it's really interesting. And I was kind of talking about this with the other students in Covina in the chat. While I identify with and work with the maiden mother crone as an archetype, like I don't necessarily put my goddesses in those boxes, right? But it's interesting to me that the goddesses that are very associated with the crone are these goddesses that are kind of on the fringes of society. They're the ones that living out in the woods in their chicken-footed hut or their,
Oh,
like,
yes. Thank you for bringing our beloved Baba Yaga to the table.
right? And I think that's very telling. That's telling on the people writing the myths or translating them, as especially as the society became more patriarchal, right? It's a really interesting kind of thread to follow for me.
I'm so glad you brought that up because, like Baba Yaga and the Kaliak, we're all set to do our annual Kaliak ritual in a few days. Um, for me, something that you said earlier was about how, like, all of these goddesses that buckled the increasing gender rigidity, that the only value for women was if they were making more Romans or more Catholics or more whatever it was, um, and taking care of the house. Like that, all of these goddesses became cronified. So Hecate becomes like a creepy crone in Macbeth. She becomes like a creepy crone in other works of art and literature, from the Middle Ages up to the Renaissance. And even today, you still see vestiges of Hecate as the crone, when to the Greeks and the Anatolians, like she was not such. Like like basically to them, the divine was ageless, was vaguely adult y, but not a crone. I've always found that really interesting, like that. So if you are a dark goddess, if you are a feminine, or I would say like non-binary or queer person, if you reject the status quo, then you're dangerous. And you get to be, and as a woman, you get to be like the ugly old hag because you've done that. Um, so I think it's beautiful. Like, I find all of that beautiful, but I mean, we see it like every Halloween, even today. This is one of my things that there's a lot of things I've learned to just not give any fucks about. But one of the things that I continue to not be able to let go of is like, you know, the way like those ugly witch things get shared, like as Halloween decorations. Um, because I think that still carries like a lot of weight in our society. People who see the dangerous woman, like they need to make the dangerous woman ugly and vilified, or it's even like when you see like caricatures, sorry, of trans people or queer people, like needing to see them in a way to like other them. Um, and I think, it really lands for people who are maybe at this intersection of the gender, goddess, and queerness, and also identify closely with the archetype of the witch, which is another really complicated spirit,
Right.
for many of us that we are adding to the crossroads, right? And I've done episodes on myself, like being the witch in the room and the archetype of the witch and the goddess Hekate. So we won't get into that today. But I just wanted to say, then there's that you can add to this whole equation too. Like if you feel that you are a witch and that this is something that's really like just true in your soul, um, that calls you into this space in a way that adds a lot of layers to your experience of gender and queerness and like being who you are in the world, that there is a lot of weight around it, and that some people could potentially, throw a lot of stones at you.
Absolutely.
Maybe not literal stones today, but they will throw rocks at you for many different aspects of simply being who you are in the world. Like you're not even doing anything, you're just trying to be yourself. And I think this is why so many people are closeted, and like it's in the witch world, like people will say they're in the broom closet, and I think
Mhm.
there's so much around people feeling comfortable to come out of the broom closet and say, yes, I identify as a witch. Yes, I'm a goddess loving witch. Hail Hecate. And I think that can even be more terrifying to come out like that way than, to come out as being queer.
Mhm.
Like, that, so there's a lot around this. And I hope this conversation has kind of gently guided you who's watching or listening to explore how you occupy this crossroads, and to do so with a lot of love and self compassion, and perhaps inspire you to have more kindness towards others who are finding their way in this liminal space as well. I do firmly believe that there is room for all of those who are authentic and here to heal and here to become whole and to connect in a really sincere way. Like I think we can have space at the crossroads of gender, the goddess, and queerness for those who would enter this circle. Um, and yeah, thank you for doing this with me, May.
Yeah, absolutely. If I could just really quickly, I want to just touch very briefly on something that you said about the caricatures, right? And I think when we think about a lot of marginalized groups, there's this tendency for the dominant culture to want to put us into this box where we're miserable and we're living on the fringes and we're not a part of society. And so, if I want to leave you with anything, I just want to say that joy is resistance, right? No matter what marginalized group you belong to, and I know it, I know myself from experience, it can be hard. It can be hard to be the only queer person in the world that you inhabit. It can be hard to be the only non-binary, the only witch, the only gay, whatever it is, the only person of color in your circle. Um, but I think there's a lot of investment in these narratives that we're all miserable and struggling. And so I just want to leave you with like just do what you can to find joy in this world and be visible about it because that is an act of resistance.
It is. To be happy, to be who you are, is the ultimate form of resistance. And to not be miserable, to be healing, um, and being true to your own self. So thank you. That was the perfect intention or prayer, whatever you want to call it, wish for everyone, to end this on. Find joy and hail Hecate. Thanks so much for
Hail
watching and
Hekate.
listening. Thanks again, May. This has been really interesting. Bye, everyone.
Bye.